Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm so happy you're back here with me. We are still in this beautiful little mountain town in Colorado. The coffee shop we normally go to, which is behind me, is closed today, but luckily there's another coffee shop in front of me. So Brian is in there hanging out while I spend a little time with you all. And today I'm really excited to talk about something that I have been really practicing lately and experimenting with, which is to intentionally allow my parts to vent, to give them full permission to express themselves, and then move in to asking self what self's perspective is. So it's kind of this 1-2 practice. Um, and so I'm excited to talk to you about that and give you some examples. But before that, I just want to give a few shout outs. Two people generously gave donations anonymously, and you both know who you are. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for that. And Erin gave another, she's a repeat offender. Thank you, Erin, for just supporting anything that you all give goes to support the overhead for my website so that I can offer all of my self-paced courses, workshops, worksheets, and meditations as free gifts to whoever wants them. So I think we might be up to about $400 now that we've raised for that, and the goal is 4,000. So we've got about 10%. So that's wonderful. And if you do give, which you would go to the bottom right of this video and either see the ellipses or a heart with a dollar sign that says thanks, and any amount that you give, I will shout you out, read your comment, and or answer your question unless you want to be anonymous. And that is completely fine as well. All right. So what I want to talk about today is something that's been really powerful and profound for me. And I always like to practice something and then bring it to you kind of as an offering. Maybe you could try this. Like maybe you could propose to your system to experiment with this as well and just kind of see what happens, right? You don't have to adopt this as a regular practice. It's just to see if it's life-giving to you or not. So, something that I've been doing is when I'm aware that parts of me get activated, right? Usually parts of us get activated when they perceive that a person or an environment or situation is a threat to us, right? And so they may or may not actually be a threat, but based on our past experience, we may perceive them as a threat, or they may actually be a threat, right? And so our parts often will get very activated. We'll have this aversion response in our body, or we'll feel anxiety in our body. Maybe our throats will clamp up. We might feel tears coming up. We might feel it in our stomach. We might feel physical pain, or we might feel shut down, right? Just completely numb. There might be lots of different responses that tell us in our body and our emotions and our nervous system that parts of us are activated by something. So we can get curious about what feels like a threat in our environment. And then, so this is what I call the both and, right? That our self and our parts are there. But when our parts feel so big, the self will often give them permission, will say, tell me what you want me to know. You have full permission to get bigger, to vent to me, right? A lot of people think, oh, well, when I have self energy or when I'm self led, it means that there's no evidence of my parts. I'm just this perfect, serene, wise angel. But that's not actually the case. The self is present and it doesn't suppress the parts. It listens to them. It gives them permission to fully vent, to fully speak, because it understands that they perceive a threat, that there's a genuine unmet need or boundary crossed or danger, right? So the self is wants to hear what's wrong so that the self can help them. All right. So I'm going to give you a few instances this last week where this happened for me. So you get a bigger or fuller picture of what this looks like. So one is kind of a relatively smaller one where I have this group thread with my self-led besties, a couple people who are really into parts work and self-leadership. And we have this group thread where we will often bring a post or something that someone is teaching, and we'll kind of say, I like this or I don't like this, or we have a nuance party where we figure out the yes and no, all and of it. And because often posts are very black and white and don't show all the different perspectives, right? So interestingly, one of my self-led besties brought a teaching from Steve March, who is someone who I did a video about not too long ago. Lots of different things that I love about Steve March's teaching. But this one was in the community where um, someone was talking about IFS, and Steve came in and made a comment about you need to be aware that a problem with internal family systems is that it tries to reify parts. And in unfoldment, which is Steve's program, we de-reify parts, right? So as soon as I read this uh, comment from uh, Steve March, my system bristled. It went, "Hmm." And so I got curious rather than saying, "Oh, you're so bad. He's an IFS teacher. You need to believe everything, or you need to not have a negative response to it." I got curious and I said, "Oh, what is that kind of like disgust response going on?" So I asked the parts and I let them fully explain to me. So the part was saying, there was a part that kind of rolled her eyes, and I was like, "Oh, he's so highfalutin," I think was her word, that he's using these words, reify and de-reify. What does that even mean? And he thinks he's so smart, and there was an initial uh, response, I think, because it felt like he was attacking IFS. And there are parts of me that feel like IFS has been such a valuable thing for me. So it's like, why is he attacking IFS? And what is he even saying? He's using these big words. Why can't he use words that people understand? So of course I go in and I look up, what does reify even mean? And I'm going to have to minimize my screen so I can go back and read you the exact definition. I got it up here, but so reify means to make something abstract more concrete or real. Okay, so what Steve was saying in the comment was that the something wrong with IFS is that IFS tries to make parts be real, and that in his program, they need to make the parts not be real. And so then I had parts, once they understood what reify meant, that started coming up and saying, um, they started coming up and saying, "What? How dare he say that we're not real? This is ludicrous," right? And so then I had all these active parts that were feeling threatened for their existence, right? And their reality. And that it's been so incredibly helpful, that part of IFS, to really understand that each part is a real full being, essentially, and that's been such a big part of the healing in my system. So of course I had all these parts that were active around it and were just pushing back against it and saying, "What's wrong with him? Why is he saying this?" So I let them vent and I listened to them. And then I very intentionally, once they felt like they were heard and they expressed themselves, I took a breath and I relaxed and I kind of intentionally stepped back so that all those parts were in front of me. And then I asked myself, that's, calm and confident and creative and connected and curious, um, what would you have me know about this? What is your perspective? And it feels like a really big energy shift. The parts feel really active and angsty and they have lots of really good points. There's nothing wrong with them. But once I kind of have heard them out, and then I intentionally step back and I allow self to speak to me, myself has like this much more expansive energy. It's much calmer. It's like it kind of smiles, and I said, what do you want me to know about this this comment from Steve March? And the self said, it says, what he's attempting to explain is that what he believes is that the essential core of a person is their self. And he really wants them to be able to connect to that and to experience that. And he feels like the focus on the parts keeps them from that, the separation of parts and self. He wants them to see that their core essence is actually their self. And so he believes, in essence, that he needs to get rid of the parts, to make them not real, to see them as a fragmentation that needs to be resolved, essentially, in order to get people to experience their self. And he's mistaken that he needs to do that, but his intention is very good. He wants people to be able to connect to that essence that is their self. And as I just kind of took in the message of the self, my whole body and my parts softened. And they still had the same perspective, right? They still believed that differently than what Steve was saying, but they began to understand where he was coming from and that he had good intention and that ultimately what he wanted was a really good thing. And so, again, in this instance, it wasn't like I had to suppress the parts and not listen to them in order to get to that place. It was actually in listening to them and fully allowing them to vent that they were able to relax enough to allow the perspective of the self to come in. So for me, it's this both and dance. Okay, so I'm going to give you one more example, and then encourage you to maybe try this out this week. So we are in kind of this campground in Colorado where there's a lot of people who are full-time RVers, right? And the particular one we're in now has really bad Wi-Fi. So at our campsite, we essentially can almost never get online at all, which is another story. There are parts of me that hate that, but there are parts of me that absolutely love that. Just having spans of time in the day when I can read and just rest and look at nature and have conversation with Brian, and internet's not even an option. But because of that, we have these very specified times of day where we go into the lodge, which is a big uh, log cabin essentially, where the they have Wi-Fi. They have like a concentrated Wi-Fi in that area. So we can go in there and we can answer emails or do whatever we need to do on our computers. So it's kind of like our work day, right? We'll go in the morning to the lodge and we stay there. So in the morning, every morning, um, there's a man there named Bob who has a group that meets for coffee. And every now and then there's a woman, but it's mainly older men. I would say probably in their 70s or 80s. There may be maybe some people in their 60s, but they drink coffee and they have conversation. And maybe because I've come to the other side now, I'm like, oh, it's very endearing, right? That they want to meet every morning and have this conversation. But as I would sit on the other side of the lodge trying to do my work, I would be listening to their conversation, and over my system would get activated, activated, activated. I started affectionately calling them the MAGA men because their positions on things, their attitudes were very conservative, very religious, very uh, supportive of Republican ideals and of Trump and things like that. So I started calling them the MAGA men. But it was this interesting dynamic where every morning I was affronted by them, you know, saying negative things about people of color and immigrants and women and LGBT community. It was, so my parts started getting so activated and so they felt so threatened, right, by these men. And so I would just sit there and I would make faces and I would say, oh, oh, right. Just one little example was there were a lot, probably the most thing they talked about the most that activated my system was they would just talk so negatively and condescendingly toward women. And uh, several of them had worked in prisons and they talked about how women are the worst and they accuse you of things. And one man was talking about a woman who came into his office and it expressed that she believed in equality for women and for people of color and for the LGBT community. And he told her, "Get the hell out of my office and don't you ever come back." And he screamed at her and slammed the door on her. And he was telling the story as he thought it was such that he was the hero in the story. And I thought it was so fascinating that I'm hearing the story from his point of view and I don't see him as the hero of the story, right? He talked about how people were afraid of him after that, which my system interpreted as a terrible thing, right? And and his system interpreted as a great thing. And I thought it was just so interesting. But my system would be activated, and so I would turn toward my parts, and they would tell me, "This is awful. Like these people are evil. How can they come to this?" There was a lot of like, I don't understand how they can even have these views, right? So I fully would listen to my parts, and I had a lot of practice with this because they would it was every morning there'd be a different activation, a different topic that they were going on about, and I would fully listen to my parts. And then at one point, once my parts felt really heard, I would again kind of step back, allow the parts to just rest next to me, take a breath, and say, "Self, what do you want me to?" I think the question I asked was, "What do you want me to learn from these MAGA men?" And myself said, "I want you to learn to love them." And my parts were like, "Huh? What?" And then they said, what is, what does that even mean? What do you mean love them? Does that mean that I need to go sit with them and be in their conversation?" And it felt like self just chuckled and said, "Oh, no, sweetheart, no, no," because, and then what self did is it showed me like this image. It didn't tell it to me, but it was essentially what Prentice Hemphill says about boundaries, right? That a healthy boundary is the distance between you and I, in which I can love both you and I simultaneously. And then self reminded me that love means value, because my parts were like, what does it mean? What does it mean for me to love them? I have to accept them. I have to agree with them. I have to, and self was like, no, no, no. It just means that you value them, that you see them as human and you have compassion and affection toward them. You don't have to agree with them and you don't have to sit with them and you don't even have to engage with them because what self said was, "Oh, sweetheart, if you sat with them, you would not be able to love them or yourself." And my parts were like, that's true." And so I continue to sit, on the other side of the lodge and listen, and I began to get really curious first about my own parts that got activated because I noticed that sometimes even just the thick Southern drawl that they would talk in would really activate my system. And one part would say, "That's not anything concrete. Like, why does that, just their accent, feel so threatening?" And my parts started showing me that my mother's mom, who we used to call my mean grandma, was the only person in my life growing up that had this very thick Southern drawl. She was from Alabama, and she had a lot of views that were racist and sexist and was just not a nice person to me or to my mom or to many people. Very, very unhappy person. And so I realized, oh, my system is equating, it like has this programming that this accent equals being mean, right? Because I experienced that with my grandmother. And so I began to have compassion on those parts and see how they made sense. And as myself was able to have empathy and compassion toward my own parts experience, then those were able to relax enough to begin to also turn that toward the MAGA men. right? To say, I wonder what experiences they've had in their life and the programming that they've had that is very patriarchal, that is very men are supposed to be dominant, men are supposed to be the alphas, men are supposed to control women, like that's their job, that's their value, right? And I wonder, like, how they were raised and the experiences they've been through, or maybe the negative experiences even that they've had with women that have, or experiences where they were afraid of people of color, or the indoctrination they had in their churches around various people that were made to they were made to see them as threatening, right? And so while of course I didn't at all agree with what they were saying and their viewpoints, I began to see how if I had gone through their same experiences and been programmed the same as them, I might come to the same conclusions as them, and that they came by it honestly. And so I was telling Brian that for me, honestly, that I think there's a progression. It might not sound great, but when we see someone as a threat, we first think of them as evil, right? They're just these terrible, evil people. And then as a little bit of self energy comes in and we're able to at least give them the benefit of the doubt of their intentions and have some kind of empathy for them, what my system moves into is maybe they're just stupid. Maybe they're just ignorant. And that's, I know that sounds bad, but it's actually a step up from their evil, right? Maybe they're just ignorant. They don't understand. They don't have all the facts. They don't, they had this upbringing that was really limited. But there's a little bit of empathy in there. And then the next step for me was actually in understanding that I am exactly like them, that I too am stupid in a sense, or ignorant, right? Because I have been trained um, more recently, like a lot by media and what Larry Rosen, I'm going to talk a little bit about Larry Rosen before I end here, but he calls them enemy makers, right? The people in media and in politics and in power who benefit financially and with power by people perceiving the other as the enemy and perceiving threat in the other. And so what I realized is I am here, I am over here looking at them thinking they're evil because I'm hearing them talk about how women and people of color and liberal people are evil. So wait, how am I any better than them? I'm thinking they're evil, they're thinking I'm evil, and maybe we're all being played in essence. Um, and so ultimately myself helped me see that I can completely disagree. It doesn't mean that I condone anything that they're saying or doing, but I can see that they're human and that they make sense and that they're more like me than I first imagined. And so by the end, I genuinely felt affection for them. And so another thing that often happens for me is when I ask self for wisdom, particularly, and sometimes I'll call out even to my ancestors and loved ones who've died to give me wisdom. The wisdom will sometimes come as a very direct, clear message, and other times it will come through different sources that are kind of put on my path, right? So during this time, as I'm experiencing every day, parts getting activated, trying to listen for self's wisdom about this group of men, I see in my YouTube feed the suggestion for something called the Enemy Project. And it was, I feel like, just this divine timing, right? Of let me show you, Christine, let me show you exactly what I mean by I want you to love them or value them. And so I start watching this, and I'm going to try to remember to put the link in because it's been so incredibly encouraging, inspiring, transformative to my system. So it's a man named Larry Rosen who basically studied under Marshall Rosenberg. I knew I recognized nonviolent communication, and my system just resonated with it. But so he basically studied with Marshall Rosenberg, and then he became a mediator with people who were getting divorced or companies who were separating or just people who were having legal conflict. And he decided to use nonviolent communication. And what he found was that people naturally, when they feel threatened by another person, when their life or their livelihood or safety is threatened, if there's any perception that it's threatened by another person, what happens in our brains is that we shut down to our empathy. Because if we don't shut down to empathy, then we allow the person to keep hurting us, right? So when we shut down to empathy, we essentially no longer have the ability to have care for them or understanding of them. So they become an enemy. And this is what he calls the enemy trance. We can no longer see them as human, right? So once we're in the enemy trance and we don't have access to empathy, we also cannot understand where they're coming from. And this happens all the time, right? With people on opposite sides of the political spectrum. We begin to see the other and their group and their leadership as a threat to us. So then we're shut down from empathy toward them and seeing them as human. We make them out to be evil, right? And then he talks about what happens is the enemy dance, which is then people who feel threatened by another, they try to get a lot of more people on their side to say, look at them, they're a threat. See what they're doing, see what they're doing. So then we have these mobs of people, tribes of people on either side dancing and growing bigger, seeing each other as a threat, calling each other evil, right? Sound familiar? And especially with social media now. And I mean, it's a huge thing. And then he talks about the enemy makers, right? Which are these people who benefit financially and power wise, whether it's media, politicians, or other people who benefit from creating a sense of threat in the other, right? And so now all these groups are kind of being manipulated and are pawns for the benefit of these enemy makers, right? And so what he found is that the way to de-escalate this is to help people gain a little bit of access back to their empathy, to help them see the other as human, to help them understand how, like the life circumstances, the life experiences they've had that make them make sense, that make them come to their conclusion honestly. And a lot of people think, well, if I understand the other person, that means I have to condone what they're doing or saying. And and so they're afraid to do that. They're also afraid because if they understand the other side, they will be ostracized by their side often, right? So there's all these reasons why they won't do that. But if and when two individual people who are on opposite sides begin to humanize each other, begin to understand each other's life experience, and the big key, and this brings us back to nonviolent communication, is understanding that the core motivations and needs are universal. So when I can understand, like, I don't agree with the strategy that the other person is using, but I understand underneath that they're trying to fulfill the same needs that I have, right? They want safety for themselves and their loved ones. They want to be able to rest and they want to be able to provide, for themselves and their loved ones. They want to be able to be understood. So when I focus on the thing that we have in common, our universal motivations, our universal needs, then I feel some connection with them. And I can still disagree with them, but I no longer see them as evil. And eventually, I no longer see them as stupid either. Um, and uh, so anyway, I will try to put that. I'll try to put a link to the actual YouTube series. The I love all of them, but the one with the trans woman and the MAGA mom, I found really powerful. The one with the pro choice woman and the pro-life man was, I went through all kinds of emotions in that one. I was angry, I was laughing, I was crying. It was, and then so because of the side that I'm on, the pro-life man, at the beginning, my system was so activated toward him. It was very, very, can't stand it. And then gradually I started to understand him a little bit and have some compassion toward him. And I thought, he's just not very intelligent, you know, poor guy, right? And then by the end, I actually felt deep respect and appreciation for him. And even some of the things that he did that I still 100% disagree with, I understood how he got there and that he made sense. So, yeah, it's not that my stance changed at all, but I no longer saw him as a threat. I no longer saw him as evil or stupid. So it was a real, I like those episodes because it's a real journey. So I encourage you, if you watch one of them, to watch the whole thing all the way through. And then maybe I'll also try to put the link to there's a podcast I'm listening to right now with Larry Rosen where he explains all of this better than I am right now. And so you might find that interesting. But let's come back to what I really wanted to highlight here is just that being in self energy and self leadership doesn't mean that we don't allow our parts to vent and essentially to consciously blend with us so that our self can fully hear them. Sometimes when we blend with those parts and we're trying to get the attention and the understanding of people outside of us, it can be really overwhelming because they can't give it to us often. So this is more about I'm blending with the parts and myself is listening. And I think that's an incredibly valuable practice to have, to let the parts vent and then to intentionally shift once the parts feel heard into essentially the parts listening to self. So the parts are venting and the self is really listening. And then the parts relax and listen to the self's perspective. And I've just found it to be such a life, not only like such a life-giving practice, but my system continually goes, oh yeah, we can do this. This is effective. This really helps us. And so my system gets excited to do it. It doesn't feel like work or problematic in any way. My parts are like, we're going to fully be heard right now, right? And then we're going to receive this incredible wisdom that we didn't have beforehand. So it's just, it feels fun in some ways to my system and just refreshing. So the next time you notice in your body, your nervous system, or your thoughts racing, that you're activated by something, rather than letting it fully take you over to get attention outside or shutting, parts might try to shut it down. See if you can intentionally set aside 5-10 minutes where you really, really listen to what the parts are upset about, and then have a little bit of space, just a minute or two even, where the self then gives that their perspective. Okay, if you don't understand what I'm saying, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those in the comments below. And let's see, if you have listened thus far, let's see, what kind of emoji could you put? Something that I guess represents peace or both and could be two or more, a group of something. It could be hearts or a dove, peace sign. um, yeah, whatever represents kind of the peaceful connection inside and outside to you. All right. Thank you for listening. May you be kind to yourselves and all your parts until we meet again.